Brown, and good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, however this might find you. And we are here for the first of the Howard Thurman Center's Give Me the Listening Ear series. And we're using this title, Conscious Raising versus Conscious Acting. And I think that's something we heard you say, Dr. Grundy.
You might have.
So we stole that from you a little bit. This is a series where what we are trying to do is to introduce particularly our students to our faculty. We are spotlighting our black and brown faculty as a way for you to get to know them a little bit about who they are, their mentors, how they got to where they are. And of course, we will banter around a little bit about the issues of the day. We'll give people a chance to ask questions, and we are in a space where there are people who will be asking questions, and we'll also be taking questions from online as well. So what I'm going to do momentarily is give each one of our professors an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to see if we can talk a little bit about some of the issues of the day. And I think we have to be if we're in a place like right now in the Howard Thurman Center with the folks that we've got here, we'd be remiss if we weren't talking about things like equity, justice, healing, and everything else that needs to be out in the society, at least for a brief moment. So with that, why don't we start with you, Dr. Austin?
Oh, wait, what am I doing?
Tell us who you are, what you do here, and all that sort of stuff, your specialties, your work, and anything else you'd like us to know.
Well, I'm Paula Austin. I am in the history department and in African American studies, and I teach African American history, civil rights history, a new course this semester called Intro to Black Studies, which is going very well, I will say.
Talk about that in a little bit.
I'm from Brooklyn. I mean, I wasn't born in Brooklyn, but I was raised in Brooklyn, yes.
Brooklyn.
There are other things. I can share other things. I'll save them.
All right, Dr. Grundy.
I'm Saida Grundy. I am joint with sociology, African American studies with my two colleagues here, and women and gender studies is my last appointment to round it out. I have been here since summer 2015, and the courses I have always taught, my sort of workhorse course is Sociology 207, which is race and ethnicity. I also teach race, class, and gender. And I also teach the graduate course in racial and ethnic minorities, which is like sort of the graduate race and ethnicity. Let's see, I am from Kentucky, like Breonna Taylor. Came here by way of graduate school at Michigan, where I paid far more than $750 each year in taxes.
Dr. Chude-Sokei.
I'm Chude-Sokei. I am a joint appointment between English and African American Studies. I'm also the director of African American Studies, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Black Scholar, currently the #1 journal in Black Studies in the country. I teach work in and around the African diaspora, and it's become so varied what I write about and what I teach that it's increasingly difficult for me to know what I do. There's just so many different things involved. I'm happy to talk about them in detail as we move forward. But I've been here now this is my 4th year, which means a 5-year appointment as director, you know. So,
is that a hint to these people?
I'm just letting y'all know.
What that's about. What?
I'm amazed that it's happened so quickly. It's happened very quickly.
It has.
It's happened very quickly.
It has.
And who are your people? Where you from? Tell us a little bit.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's one of the reasons things are so complex for me. My people are spread out all over the African diaspora. I was born in Nigeria and grew up in Jamaica and migrated to the United States when I was about 10 years old. I describe myself as half African, half Caribbean, and half African American. Bad math, but absolutely accurate.
And also joining us is Dr. Kendi. Dr. Kendi, tell us a little bit about you and what you do. We don't know a thing about it, but just checking in with you.
Well, sure. I was born in Queens, not Brooklyn, but Queens. Just playing Paula. But we also moved to Northern Virginia when I was in high school. My name is Ibram Kendi, and I'm in the history department. I would like to be in African American Studies too, if anybody, if they would allow me to be. And I teach courses, on the history of racism and even anti-racism, and yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Well, Dr. Kendi, let me start with a question with you. For you, a lot of our students are asking, okay, when can I take a class? with Dr. Kendi. Can you give us a sense of that?
So I'm doing a fellowship this year at the Radcliffe Institute. That's why I'm not teaching this year, but next year I should be teaching.
And more than likely, it will be co-listed with African American Studies.
We'll vote on it.
Vote taken, boom.
Well, let's reflect a little bit about the time we're in right now. There is a lot of stuff going on. Some people say it's kind of crazy out there. And, you know, I guess I'd love to ask you from the standpoint of a Black scholar, because that's what you all are. What do you make of this time? Tell me a little bit about some meaning, if you can find any in any of this. But especially for a young person who you will teach, who you will work with, what do we take from this, and what do we take from this either personally? What do we take from this moving forward? What should I take from this as a student?
From this moment.
This moment, yes. Moment and the movement and everything else.
Movements.
Well, I would say there is never not a time where it is not important to be a Black scholar, right? I think all of us on here represent a very long tradition that goes back to Du Bois, that goes back to Mariah Stewart, that goes back to Ida B. Wells, if you know, in the social sciences. We really see ourselves as inheriting a tradition that at every moment in this country, we're sort of the stalwarts of telling the truth. And, you know, because, for the historians, there are those who would say, the past is everything that happened before this moment, and history is what we write about it. And for some of us, those should be the same thing. So I think that Black historians have the job of doing that. On my end, in terms of sociology, I think it's a very opportune time because you not only get to autopsy social problems as they're happening, you sometimes have a play in where things are going because you connect those pieces. It's a particularly opportune time to be teaching Black studies, though. I think all of us have had that experience, that the urgency our students feel to learn this, the more that they feel it's mandatory, the more they feel their lives are incomplete without understanding Black studies. I think this is particularly ripe for that.
I would just throw in that we're at a point right now where, as a student, there should be no doubt in your minds that you and your experience of the world matter now more than ever. Not only in terms of voting, but much of what we're seeing, I believe, is the toss-up and chaos of old orders that are crumbling and are struggling to establish themselves and draw lines around themselves and retrench. But if I were you, I would imagine that I'm seeing edifices collapse, structures crumble and fall apart. And for you, that's a wonderful thing, right? Because you are the ones literally living through cleaning up, right? And reestablishing new possibilities. And what we do as scholars, certainly I think this about the work that I do, is present the material that you will be hopefully using to rewrite and restructure the future. As dark as things seem, I envy the really young right now, because you're more than likely going to be the ones on the other side of it, right? So I feel really empowered to create materials for you to use, because again, you're going to have to clean this up.
Dr. Austin, Dr. Ken?
So, I mean, I would say part of the beauty about being a Black scholar, I think now in this moment, is really the community of Black scholars. It's just, I mean, even the three of these scholars and other Black scholars at BU, and certainly around the region and country, there's just an incredible community of scholars who are studying and writing and reimagining. And so to me, that's the most fascinating sort of aspect. But then also, I think I haven't been able to be in the classroom in this moment, but what I would imagine is there's something about a time in which you could speak to students and teach students something that's literally in the headlines, day in and day out. And you can really draw from that. And students sort of see in real time how what they're learning is playing out You know, I think that that's quite powerful, and thereby, and what they're unlearning, and how that's also sort of playing out. You know, I just think that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, I second everything that everyone said. I think that for me, it's been a long moment, really. I mean, I remember having to shift how I was teaching the history of the development of white supremacy after Michael Brown was killed. And I remember students, I was teaching in New York, and I remember students who would email to say they weren't coming to class because they were going to a protest. And I'd be like, you know, yeah, when you come back, we'll talk about what that was. And so I was in the classroom with the students who were not going to the protest and but I remember having to make the kinds of shifts that I think are important now to help students understand the relationship that the contemporary moment had to the history and how the history laid foundations for for both the crumbling and the possibility of the crumbling, but also for a long history of reimagining, right, and of expanding access. And I think the realization that is constant work as opposed to some naturalized thing. But that seems to me, that's not new. I mean, I feel like in the years that I've been teaching, that's always been the thing that I think that students sort of are like, oh, you know, I didn't realize I didn't realize kind of what this long tradition looked like. So, you know, in that way, it's a little bit of it's a tough moment, actually, to be a Black scholar. It's an enormous amount of responsibility to do it right.
So would any of you have been offended if we took tonight, we talked, and I did not ask you about being a Black scholar?
I mean, I think I would have ended up talking about it.
You're right. We would.
I don't.
That's who we are,
Right.
right? That is. Yeah.
Would we have been offended if you didn't identify the category?
Yeah, that's right.
No, I wouldn't have been offended.
Right. We would.
It's such a self-evident category.
Absolutely.
Well, I say that because, you know, we get people who will say, why do you always have to talk about the Black stuff with the Black stuff?
That's a different question.
That's
Right. Yeah, that is a different
It's an
question.
important question.
And why these are people in history and English and here and there. Why did you have to go there?
Well, and then the question is, why don't we ask white faculty about Black scholarship, right? Like, you know, that's always the question for us, is like, you know, I think that, you know, in spaces like this, we carry, of course, the lion's share of bringing this, you know, intellectual tradition into these spaces, but that's only because white scholars have been able to advance their careers without ever having to know that, right? I have to know their stuff, right? I have to know Marx, I have to know Weber, right? They don't have to know Du Bois in a way that is egregious to me, considering he's the father of American sociology, right? So that is the larger question to me. So, you know, when we talk about, you know, diversity in these spaces, it's not just about bringing Black scholars in. The power becomes in what do you consider intellectualism, right? What do you consider knowledge in these spaces? And that's what really changes the discipline for us, and it therefore changes our engagement with our careers.
And I would add, even for white scholars who are steeped in a white intellectual tradition, why they don't identify as white scholars. Because, you know, when you look at the people that they offer, the intellectuals that they cite, the theories that they reference, the literature that they give in their classes, who they think is valuable, it's almost all white people. So why don't they identify as white scholars? And why are they in such denial that they're white scholars? We're not in denial about the traditions of the folks that we stand on.
And I want to throw into the mix, though, that as Black scholars, that should never suggest that there's a specific ideology that we all adhere to, right? Blackness in thought is just as complex as, I don't know, whiteness in thought, right? There are those for whom being a Black scholar means you're limited in some ways, which is completely untrue, deeply racist, and, you know, one of the reasons I decided to do what I did, and I chose to be a Black scholar, right? Simply because I was committed to bodies of knowledge that weren't getting the attention that they deserved, and perspectives that fed into, for example, white mainstream scholarship that were marginalized and ignored, and put politics aside for a minute, although that is politics, the goal was to just say, wow, look at how much we don't know. And why is so much that we don't know produced by people who are not white?
So, Louis, when did you decide? You said, I decided to be a Black scholar. Were you 13? I mean, when did that happen that you decided
About 4 years ago.
that you were going to do this in the first place, but that you're going to be a Black scholar?
About 4 years ago.
Seriously, huh?
I describe myself as an accidental academic, right? In that I never planned to become a professor or a scholar. I just planned to always find ways to read books as much as possible, write books as much as possible, be involved in music and cultural production as much as possible. And so I just kept pursuing those things, publishing magazines and journals and putting together spoken word and doing protests, all those different things. For me, that was just what I kept doing. And I met people that, although I didn't realize it, were kind of shaping me into a path that would lead to graduate school, which I accidentally went to graduate school. I mean, I don't want to tell you the whole long story, but it literally was accidental. It was never a plan. It was like many people go to graduate school is, I need more time to do nothing.
Which don't do anymore. The economy is changing.
I need some more time to just keep reading and doing these things. Why not? And then opportunities began to open up. But that doesn't mean I ideologically chose to do this work, right? It was just like, yo, you gonna pay me to spend a couple of years teaching about African literature and jazz? All right. Okay. And that just grew and grew. The ideological commitment did come later. I can't give you a day, but it did come much later.
But it was later.
And it probably happened closer, believe it or not, to the tenure thing. Because one thing we may or may not discuss is not just Black scholars vis-a-vis whiteness, but Black scholars vis-a-vis Black scholars. Because that's a complicated world as well. And that was, for me, the most forbidding aspect of this.
Interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. Paula,
When I do this, I'm not pointing at Saida.
Yeah, yes, you are. Was it the same for you, Paula, as well?
Yeah, I mean, so I saw a tweet today. Someone was asking, like, what did they were looking for kind of like people to weigh in, like how they made the decision to either go directly to grad school, to, I actually didn't, so I'm a first generation college student. I was the first person in my family to get an undergrad degree, a BA. And after that, I just went to work like my sisters did. I taught adult literacy for many years, and I did some political organizing, some youth organizing. And I went to grad school. I went to get a master's mostly because I was interested in figuring out, I had a research question. And I was like, what does one do? I don't know. Like, I'm interested, I wanted to know the history of essentially the development of public education in the US, because here I was teaching adult basic ed, doing GED preparation. And I was like, why are all my students Black and brown, right, Afro-Caribbean, like, why are these my students? And so I was like, maybe history has an answer. I did not find that answer. And I came out of that master's program kind of just with more questions. I continued working, and I think I got the opportunity to do some adjuncting at a couple of community colleges in New York, and it was a hustle to get those jobs every semester. And I was like, will a PhD help me? Like, is this, like, how do you keep those jobs? Like, I don't know. And so that's how I got into a PhD program. And I didn't get into the first PhD program that I applied to. And actually, Eric Foner was basically like, this is not the program for you. And I was like, all right, Eric, I see you. But I went to see Manning Marable because, I don't know,
These are huge names, by the way.
Yeah, these are like celebrities in history.
I was like, can I come talk to you? I mean, I didn't know anything about what I was doing, right? So I went to see Manning Marable.
You just knocked on Manning Marable's door.
I just like,
As one does.
I just knocked on Manning Marable's door.
Paula does.
Paula does.
Manning Marable's like the Michael Jordan.
Yeah, right. Straight up. Like,
And he met with me. We talked a little bit about, this is before Eric Foner told me that was not the program for me, but we talked a little bit about like what a dissertation is and who the audience is for that. I did not get into that program. But yeah, once I did, I mean, I was sort of like, I was a non-traditional student. I had gone back to grad school very late, and I absolutely did not have any, I didn't know about tenure track jobs. I didn't know you could work full time, like doing that. And so I kind of just thought I was going to keep all my adjunct positions. And then I got a tenure track job. I mean, I had the most amazing advisor when I was in grad school, and he was incredibly supportive. Hermit Bennett, he's a Latin Americanist, he does African history. And I got a tenure track job, and I got a second tenure track job. So, I mean, I don't really know how I did that. I know that there were a bunch of people who supported me and helped me figure that stuff out. Jennifer Morgan and Herman Bennett are like these are my intellectual kind of parents, and who really understood kind of how you navigate the academy as a Black woman. And so that, they helped me figure that stuff out and were incredibly supportive of me.
So talk a little bit more about this. We also, while there's a real specialty here, you're hearing things like tenure track and everything else, these are very pinnacle positions in higher education. It's what we strive for. Talk to us a little bit about work, this aspect of this as being work, because a lot of what you talk about is also what people have to do at work. I used to be a lawyer, and I had to do the same sorts of thing from a standpoint of partnership, tenure in effect, and also navigating the politics and everything else. Talk a little bit about the work aspect of this, which you still probably encounter, all of you still do.
Yeah. I mean, I want to be real. I mean, I think I'm going to let you all talk about what the work looks like, but I want to be very real that, like, my sisters and my mother had a very different kind of work. I mean, my mom, we lived with my mom while she was a domestic health aide. She lived in with the woman that she was taking care of. We sort of secretly lived there for many years until my grandmother came from Guyana, that's where I was born. And so once my grandmother came, my sisters and I moved in with my grandmother, and my mother continued to live in the apartment with the woman that she was taking care of. But, and her job was 24/7 basically. And my sisters, worked for banks. I mean, they had very different jobs. And so, my family really never understood what this work was.
Oh, yeah.
So I had to translate it because it was clear to me that it was a hustle and it was a job in the way my mother had taught me to hustle. But it didn't fully translate. I mean, she was like, "You're a teacher." And I was like, "Yes." But the other stuff about, like, my work hours didn't really translate. And also, it was definitely an easier job than my mother and my sisters had, at the same time that it is a hard job.
Dr. Kendi, how about you in terms of these decisions and this work and everything else that you were doing?
Yeah, it's fascinating because, there's this critique that professors only work, 20 hours a week. And I don't know if I've ever only worked 20 hours a week in my whole career. And so I think, at least for me, I haven't considered it to be work. I mean, I'm just passionate about reading and writing and discussing and thinking. I'm not necessarily passionate about university politics and, dealing with racism or paternalism but that's been more of the work aspect for me, sort of having to sort of navigate departmental and university politics and personalities and egos. But in terms of the actual thing we do behind the scenes when it's just us, in the archive or with students, that's not work for me.
Saida, you come from pedigree, though, with this academic stuff, don't you?
My colleagues jokes, they say Saida's a BAP, which stands for Black American Princess, because they say she was born into this. I wouldn't say the princess part. I would say that my parents came from, on my mother's side, very educated people, and my grandfather, which was rare for someone born at the turn of the 19th century. My grandfather was college educated, Lincoln University. So we come from a long line of Black colleges, right? And my parents were sort of that integration era who integrated many of their high schools and colleges and really wanted me to go to Black college. I feel like this was not accidental for me I am the sum total of a lot of people's efforts, right? A lot of people directed me right to here and are very satisfied to see me here. You know, I came up with, you know, many of the people on my shelves now were just members of my community, a Black nationalist, Black radical community. And so I really thank my parents for, in our household, the celebrities were Black scholars. In our household, Manning Marable was the man, right? And in our household, it was like, Vincent, Ivan Van Sertima was a man. It's like, these are people who, my father, he would sit at the dining room table, read their books, and he would say, Saida, come over here. And he would give me passages that I would have to read. And that was how we engaged. So when I went to college, again, it was not accidental. I went to Spelman College. I had no idea that Black women were ostracized within the academy, because to me, the whole world was like Black feminists. And I was trained by Beverly Guy Sheffield. I did not know that Black women were ostracized. I thought that everyone recognized Black women's intellectualism because that's how I entered, when and where I enter, right? And so I was really pipelined into the academy by a program by the UNCF Mellon Foundation, which targets sophomores in college and says, we're basically gonna teach you how to become an academic from this level. And every level through tenure, they have supported me on this journey. So I really feel like this was preordained for me in terms of, children emulate who they see. I came up around Black people who were radicals in the movement, and then when it came time to pay mortgage, became professors. So that was how
For anyone who's ever met Saida's parents, I remember the first time I met him, I was like, hey, it's nice hanging with you, Saida, but I want to go over here and hang out with your dad for a little bit.
Shout out to Chester Grundy, who I know is watching.
It's like, let me go hang out with your dad for a little bit. You don't mind. I think actually you left me with your parents.
Oh, I knew you all would click immediately.
I said, nah, they could stay with me. Go.
First of all, y'all all country, so I knew you would click immediately. My parents are Southern Black people too, so.
For those who don't know me, I'm Southern Black.
All right.
Well, why don't we start to get that microphone around in here? If folks want to ask some questions, feel free. We won't put the camera on you as you ask your questions, but why don't you go ahead and do that? And for those of you who are watching via the web, why don't you go right ahead and start to ask your questions, and we will do our best to get a few of those up. And I've got a couple of them, but as we start to move around. But if we can move that mic around, and let's give the folks here the first opportunity to ask some questions, and then we will get to the web. I see a hand over.
Hi, so I was just wondering, working at a PWI, how do you feel like being a Black academic in a predominantly white space?
Good question.
Any of you can go for it.
Let's see. How do I feel? You often feel overtaxed, right? I think that's common because I'll explain it this way. The basis of being an academic is that you have colleagues, and your colleagues usually go two directions. You have colleagues within your discipline. So if you're a historian, all the historians are your colleagues, right? All the history professors are your colleagues. And then you have colleagues within your university. So my immediate colleagues would be people at BU who aren't even in my discipline. I would add to that, when you're a Black scholar, your colleagues are kind of everybody Black who's also a professor. So it adds this layer of community in which I actually thrive in that, because it sort of means I'm a member of a formal institution and this informal institution called Black scholarship, right? Within BU, I've had a really probably wonderful experience in terms of I've felt supported here. I have real friends within, the sociology department. I have, support from, administrators makes a huge difference. I say this as someone whose father spent 45 years in university administration. It makes a huge difference to the success of black faculty if you have administrators backing them. But along with that, it can really come down to if you are doing the type of scholarship that your department feels is valuable and tenurable. Not everybody gets black scholarship, particularly if it is not something that in any way sort of centers whiteness or in any way they can recognize it, right? So, I think, we all have these questions of like, students might not understand publishing. Publish or perish is sort of what we do, right? We have to produce peer-reviewed works, we have to produce books, we have to produce articles, right? Not just newspaper articles, those don't count, journal articles. What is important to black scholars might not be recognized by your white colleagues. But then it's like, but all of our tenure letters are probably going to be strongest from the network of black scholars to which we belong. But your colleagues might not understand what that is. So those kind of things have to get ironed out. Those can be sort of impasses that I think any black scholar faces in their career. I definitely say you need a critical mass of black faculty at any institution for black faculty to be successful. Bringing in one of us does not make a difference.
I'd like to say, though, that I've only ever taught at institutions like this. And so I've spent much of my time creating alternate community outside of either the institution that I'm working at or through other cultural spaces, other things that matter to me, but also connecting to folks at other universities, but either activists or artists or people who do cultural work. So that's always been my way of balancing being a black faculty at a university that's predominantly white, right? Again, I've never taught at a predominantly, otherwise university, right? One thing I'd say that's different, though, from what my colleague just said is that I'm a black scholar, but I'm also someone whose work is rooted in immigration and dealing with alternate experiences of race, alternate experiences or responses to racism. And so some black scholars don't support that or don't quite understand it. And so I've had to negotiate that world at the same time as negotiating the problems that she well articulated around white scholars dealing with, black work. So the best community of black scholars I've actually ever encountered in my own immediate life and professional world is actually you, right? Because I think some of my colleagues here could probably tell you about how bad community can be with different ideological commitments, different gender norms, and right? So, right, it can be incredibly difficult, all right, to negotiate all of those things. And I just want to emphasize that blackness or black community is also an endlessly negotiated phenomenon.
Absolutely.
As a scholar, but also as a human being.
Absolutely.
You mentioned other faculty and being in community with other black faculty here. And one of the things that we want to try and do with this Listening Ear series is to expose the community to a number of black faculty who are here. So over the course of this series, you stick with it, you will be surprised at some of the people you'll see and say, wow, we got people like that here.
And the habit, though, is because we're black and we're talking about being black faculty, the habit is to just privilege that. If it weren't for, queer faculty and brown faculty and feminist alterity or difference, faculty from other kinds of backgrounds, Asian American, et cetera, have been essential to my success. I mean, a lot of the people that helped me through were people who I didn't quite understand. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that this person, identified in this way or that way or what have you, but they were supporting me the whole time.
Yeah, allyship and solidarity from other faculty means the world, and particularly if those people are in positions of power like senior
Absolutely. Faculty. I mean, one of the accidents that led me to graduate school, I remember I was about to graduate and leave the university. Couldn't get a job. At the time I had dreadlocks and I was just looking the kind of person you wouldn't want to hire. Right? But things were just kind of confusing at the time. And I remember walking across campus and for the first time in my entire career, the chair of the English department, who I'd never spoken to, stopped me and asked me, hey, what are you going to do after you graduate? And I'm like, I don't know. Why are you asking me? I'm like, I don't know you. But eventually he said, you should apply to our program. And I'm like, why would I apply to your program? He said, because, and he listed off things that I had done. Like I published a black magazine that was very anti-English department. I was shocked that he'd read it. Like, right? And I'd also been a loudmouth in my classes about racism and classism and sexism, et cetera. I didn't realize that this white, older man actually saw all of those things as good things. And he said, apply to graduate school, apply to us. I said, all the deadlines have passed, you know. And he said, well, so what? Just apply to this one. He said, don't worry, you're going to get in. And I said, well, I can't afford it. He said, we'll work on that. Don't worry about it. And I got in, of course, because he said I was going to get in. And I got a TA-ship. And that's how I got into graduate school. And it literally happened like that, me walking across campus trying to figure out, because the job that I had applied for the day before, like a couple of days before, was security guard job. Right? And I was like waiting to hear from them if I was going to be a security guard. I got that. So that, and he was very supportive. But after that, it was not like he was my buddy. Never saw him again. I just saw him around, and he was still the same person that I had no relationship with.
Can I add to that for those of our students who might be thinking, well, like maybe the professoriate is for me? Literally on my 19th birthday, my dean at Spelman was like, have you considered the professoriate? And that's where my career began. I did not know, because, you know, my parents do not have PhDs, and no one was really breaking down the sort of business of this stuff. I did not know things like, oh, you probably will go to grad school for free, and they will pay you a stipend if you go to a PhD program. You know, my sister got into law school, and I remember we were eating like mayonnaise sandwiches when my sister was at Penn Law. I was like, this has to be the most expensive education in the world, the way we struggling. And, you know, but I did not know that this option was there. And I really want to tell first generation students, I really want to tell, our students who are working class, like, this can be for you, right? This is an option for furthering your advancement that doesn't necessarily put a financial burden on you. If you are getting a PhD, a master's, you might have to pay for or get a half scholarship, but I encourage you to consider a PhD. A doctorate will always trump a master's outside of professional programs, even within. But it is something that is within reach for you.
And you don't have to be a professor with it.
And you don't have to be, in fact, I had every intention leaving the University of Michigan to not enter the professoriate. I thought I was gonna go work in, the philanthropic world, and I would be like one of these, project managers at, some, big philanthropic shop, and literally went on the job market because it's sort of perfunctory in terms of what you do. I was not going to apply to this job because grad school was so undone my confidence at the University of Michigan. I was like, I can't get to like a BU like that. I'm never gonna get a tenure track job at like a name brand university, right? And I remember my, dear friend, Courtney Cogburn, who was at Michigan with me in psych, she said, no, you make them tell you no. You apply and you make them tell you no, which is what I did. And then 2 weeks later, Linda Haywood called me on the phone and said, you're coming out here for an interview. That's how it started.
All right, we've got a question. We've got a few questions. Let me throw a few out here, and maybe these go hand in hand. Louis, you had mentioned this of systems collapsing and the need to reestablish new possibilities. Now, this person may be seeing my vote mask, and I took it off because folks couldn't hear me. They go on to ask, but is it right to push students to be involved in the vote when we know that these systems aren't working?
That's a great question. May I say something?
And let me throw one other question in there, because I think this also goes a little bit to who you may all think you are or not. But I'm wondering if you look at yourself as a different brand of activism, or not. Maybe you do, or maybe you don't. Because there's that question about when do we go from sort of the listening and the learning to the action. I know I perceive all of you as people who engage in action. It's just different. It's one way. So let's throw those two things out there and see if we can handle them a little bit. Why, when these systems are just crumbling, should we engage them? And then what's more, are you all engaged in some form of activism yourself?
Let me say something. the Republican Party spent $40 million during 2010 to gerrymander these districts so that young people and people of color could not vote. If your vote didn't matter, there seems to be a whole lot of effort to keep you from doing it. That's exactly how much it matters. They literally, down to surgical precision, are trying to keep you from voting. That's how much your vote matters, right? Because it does, it actually does, right? When we look at, basically who gets caught in the dolphin net of voter suppression, unlike any other policy, was explicitly designed to keep Black people away from the polls, but young people definitely get caught in that dolphin, that tuna net, basically. They're the dolphins getting caught in the tuna net because young people also tend to vote in ways that Black people have voted in terms of progressiveness, et cetera. Yeah. So, you'll see it in this state, and, in Maine, throughout New England, you'll see it throughout the nation, really. These really, really exacted ways to be like, oh, well, you need to have a car registration if you want to vote. Well, that's to get college students out of particularly local elections. Mm-hmm. That's how much your vote matters. You can actually, if just the students in Boston voted as a block, they could change the mayor, right? That's how much your vote matters. The activism piece, to me, I came from the camp, Spelman College. This was drilled into us every single day. You're a scholar activist, you're a scholar activist, you're a scholar activist, you're Anna Julia Cooper, you're Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, as a 19th and 20th century Black woman journalist, sociologist, she was the one who said, I can prove to you through data, through quantitative data, that the reasons white people give for lynching us are not true. And that is my entire approach to this field, that I am going to prove with data that what you say about my people is not true. That's the scholar activist to me, right? So activism can look like in the streets. Activism can look like what you do in an institution. And if we were looking at a military, not everyone is in the trenches, right? Some people are, in other parts of the battlefield. What we do is part of that other part of the battlefield, right? And in fact, I see myself in many ways as preparing soldiers for the battlefield.
Oh, sorry, Ibram, please.
Go ahead, Ibram.
Oh, no, I was just going to say very briefly that I think the student said something about the system, why sort of participate in the system when it's not working. I think that one of the things that Black scholars have been saying, certainly this year, is that it's actually working quite well, just not for you. And so so this idea that, oh, it's broken, or it's, so why, work with something that's broken? I mean, that whole framework is just not accurate. And so I think it's what we should really think about, as Professor Grundy talked about, is there's a systemic effort to make voting work specifically for white, particularly conservative people. And so what we thereby need to do is, of course, ensure that the system is working for us. The other thing I think it's important to know is, what you say system, what do you mean? And I think students, and even, even us scholars, when we use terms like systems, we need to also make sure, or I should say, students should certainly understand, what do you mean when you say systems? I've heard people say to me, oh, why try to challenge the system? Because even if we were to destroy the system, it'll reboot itself and continue to harm Black people. So in other words, they believe the system is working on AI, right? That it's, and don't really understand the way power sort of operates, right? And that people actually embodied in that power. And so I also think we should really rethink how, when we use the term like system, what that really means.
Absolutely.
I would just add briefly, what they've both said is great and answers, I think, addresses the question, but I don't think anyone here is saying that voting is all you need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
We're certainly not saying that voting is all you need to do.
And our ancestors did not say that. In fact, King very clearly said the vote cost them nothing. It cost them nothing to give us the vote, right? That is just basically the threshold to other forms of power.
Absolutely.
We've got a question.
Is this on?
Yes,
Yeah, it's on.
we can hear you.
Professor Grundy, I took your class before COVID hit.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's all good. And all I wanted to say is I remember a day where I said to a friend, this is great and all, but the people who really need this message are not here, and they'll never be here because your title has race in it, or
Right.
all of your guys' titles have something to do with race or gender. So I'm asking all of you guys, does it ever concern you that although you're doing great work, that either one, the people who really need this message are not in your class, or does it not concern you at all?
I just have to say, though, I don't actually believe that. I would agree that not enough of those people who need it know it. But I've witnessed in my life an incredible shift and growth, which we can map, or we can argue about the details of this, but we can map it in the kinds of the protests that are out there right now. But we can also map it in the fact that as a Black director of African American studies, I now have to evaluate applications in African American studies by increasingly white students in African American studies, right? Or African studies, well, that's a different history and a longer one. But without getting in too much into the details and the politics of that, it is not true that we're not being heard. What they do with that knowledge is another conversation, but I do believe that things are in fact being engaged in a much broader way than we might know, right? And so I have hope in that because I see evidence of it. Again, there's much to complain about with the appropriation and acceptance and engagement with that material, but we can't say it's not happening.
And I'd add that, you know, when I was teaching adult literacy, we were sort of proponents of Paulo Freire's idea about what education and what the approach to education is. And so I assume that the work that I do in the classroom with students and that the kind of critical analysis that we're doing in primary sources and understanding some of the foundational, in the US context anyway, but also globally, the foundations for many of the quote unquote systems and structures that we have, I assume that people who are engaged in that and deconstructing that and understanding that are having conversations outside of my classroom. That is my assumption. It might not be true, but that part of it is not the part that I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is what we're doing in that room together. Right. The understanding, the learning, the problem solving, the visioning, right? New ways and more just ways. And my assumption is that everybody goes out and continues to have these conversations. Right. Maybe that's not happening, but
I want to add to that because, I mean, Teen Vogue writes about Kimberly Crenshaw. I mean, intersectionality and, you know, all these issues are in public conversation. We can argue about the nature of those conversations. But one of the things I've always done because of the alternate communities that I've engaged in, culture, music, sound, etc., I travel a lot internationally. And one of the things I've always done and continue to do is have conversations about this material with people who aren't graduate students or academics or even college educated. And I have never not had lots of people wanting to have these conversations, right? So for me, the question is not that there's not enough people who want the conversations. I just think there's not enough people who are able to translate the conversation, right? Because there is a hunger, which is why, you know, in terms of publishing, because working with a journal, I pay attention to publishing, stuff written about race, gender, and sexuality is flying off the shelves.
Absolutely.
Right? Ask Ibram.
Absolutely. Right.
Right? But not because college students and, you know, but because their parents and grandparents and people want to read this stuff, right? So that stuff is happening.
So this
and Imani wanted to say hello to everyone. You want to say hello?
hi.
Yes, we have a new panelist.
Hi, Money.
Future scholar in the house.
Yes, definitely.
How do you, and I think you sort of answered it, but and Saida, it goes a little bit to a recent piece I saw that you wrote in the Atlantic about reading lists.
Yes, right.
And almost a bit of what this conversation, race conscious versus consciousness versus action.
Right.
How would you recommend talking to someone? This is a question from the web. How do you recommend talking to someone about how systematic racism still affects Black people? I've tried to share resources, but people still just don't believe me or that it exists. And maybe this goes a little bit more to that translation, that conversation, but talk to us a little bit about that, about how you recommend people go about translating and having these conversations outside of your classroom, outside of reading your book. And by the way, I said this to Ibram before. Everyone's got a copy of How to Be an Anti-Racism. I rarely find people who've read it.
Right.
But how do we work that sort of thing?
I just want one thing I'll toss in to connect it to what you were saying, Saida. It's important to know that it's also built into the academic culture.
Yes.
Right. It's a barrier. For example, writing work that's public may not get you tenure.
And it might even get you backlash.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So it tends to be people who have to either get to a point after doing the academic work. Like in my case, I've always done them parallel, right? But not everyone can do everything. But being able to produce work that larger groups of people can read, that's a whole nother set of struggles that we shouldn't assume that everyone can do it or should.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And let me just please, Dr.
Even you said?
Oh, no, I was just gonna give an example of what Louis was sort of speaking about. I mean, after I published my second book, Stand from the Beginning, I had colleagues in the history department who I thought were friends, or who were friends, who also told me that book was not scholarly. And I've also had people say that second book shouldn't go towards tenure, which is why I, ended up sort of I was an assistant professor for more than 7 years, and then I jumped from assistant to full because I had 2 books, and I finally found an institution that was willing to support both of my books as academic books, and so it's certainly sort of a struggle, and it certainly has been one for me.
Yeah, it really is. Let's keep it real. One of the most pernicious and consistent ways that white supremacy operates within the academy is telling you what is scholarship and not, right? Yeah. That ultimate barrier around what is an intellectual contribution and what's not, right? It's much like other fields. Well, that's not art, right? Graffiti is not art until white people say it is and put it in the MoMA, right? That is very much what we struggle with too. I will say to that question that just came in, this is not the sugar-coated answer. I'm gonna give you what I would really give you if you were my student. There is a difference between lack of knowledge and white ignorance. White ignorance, as Charles Mills would describe it, is an actual generative, constructed action, right? It's an activity in which it's a denial, right? It's not just a lack of knowing. And so what you are running up against is not people who just have an empty cup and are waiting for you to pour into it. It's an active denial of these things in which it's really, it's a way of doing sort of ideological violence, and it's a way of subjugating peoples of color by denying that these things are in any way real and really denying their humanity. So on what we do, my former student over here, I recognize that in the classroom, we each navigate those forms of white ignorance in the ways that I've just talking about, that sort of active cognitive violence, right? But to speak emotionally, when I enter the classroom every semester, I have my first day, and I look out and my class looks nothing like BU. It always looks like, I'm like, this is not what our data says this campus is made up of. And I look and I see a whole bunch of young Black women in my class, and I see a whole bunch of Asian students. I see students who are international who have no real, they're like, I'm taking this class because this American race thing makes no sense to me and I want in, right? I walk into that class every time, and my students want to be there. And for me, it is such an emotionally rewarding act to know that, I am giving you the experience I got, right? I'm giving you what made me understand that there wasn't an asterisk next to my intelligence. I wasn't the smartest Black girl at Spelman, right? I came out of Spelman College thinking you can do anything. There's nobody out here better than you, right? I want my students to get that from me. And it is so important to me. I tell them this every semester. I say this class, one of our goals is to make you uncomfortable because you cannot teach the race and in the U.S. context without getting uncomfortable. If you want to go watch a Disney movie, watch that, but that's not race, right? This is to make you uncomfortable. And I say, if it really makes you uncomfortable, you'll be all right. I'm the only black professor you're going to have here, right? This whole place is for you. This will be the only time in your life that it's not about you. Welcome.
Do you all feel this is a bit of a, and this is pulling off of someone's question here, a divergence from a mainstream, what you do? Do you have to diverge, or do you see it as something different?
I mean, I don't know, and even we can,
And
like,
how do
you
you
can,
do that, by the way? This person's almost asking.
The divergence from
European mainstream, you know, if you will.
I mean,
how do you do that? When do you do that? Is this a divergence at all?
no, not in my
double
discipline.
consciousness.
Not in my discipline. I mean,
Right.
in the history field, I mean, the scholarship that we have books that we can read that are written by scholars, by black scholars, but also by white scholars that are of a new historiography, that look at the things that we've been looking at for the last 150 years of the discipline or 200 years of the discipline, that have shifted in the last 50 years or so how we are looking at things like the institution of slavery, at racial segregation, at racial terror, racial violence. So the scholarship has changed.
Yeah.
The scholarship has changed. It's just that it's definitely not getting down to the elementary, middle, and high school level. And
Very
in
true.
only some people's classrooms at the college, at the university level.
Very true.
But the scholarship is there, and it is clear, and it is empirical. So this is not like it's Paula Austin's approach to
Right.
this. It is absolutely not. I mean, I'm bringing in old white guys who were doing this in the 70s, right? Edmund Morgan, Ira Berlin, right? And then newer scholars, Marisa Fuentes. I mean, so people have been writing about this since the 70s. The scholarship was changing.
I would say, I mean, all traditions of thought diverge endlessly, right? So the idea that there's a mainstream that we diverge from is sort of not quite right. Right? The mainstream diverges from itself and fragments and does all kinds of psychedelic things. I speak as someone who, back to the question of my choice to do this work, I got my PhD doing Renaissance, Restoration and Romantic, Victorianism, and early modernism. There was no such thing as diaspora, transnational flows in discourse. That didn't exist. When I was in graduate school, the only person people had known about was this guy named Edward Said, who'd written Orientalism. But because of that, and because those books were about really essentially 19th century British lit, I was able to use 19th century British lit and discover, oh, they all owned slaves. Oh, the whole edifice of Victorianism and modernism was actually erected on plantation slavery, which isn't mentioned in these books, but these books always feature ghosts showing up with accents. I'm like, things like that got me thinking about a broader picture. But I bring this up because I was trained French existentialism, which then leads to post-structuralism and all of that. I got trained in the European stuff. And so because I didn't have access to the black stuff, but I grew up in a Caribbean and African-American immigrant household where people would talk about Stokely Carmichael, and they just talked about these people. I thought, oh, well, why don't I just look for those people, how they intersect with that material? And I say this because I think of myself, and this is why CLR James matters so much to me. Like, I'm as modern and as Western as they come. And a lot of this black intellectual tradition is not a divergence at all.
And I think the other side of the sort of conversation on divergence or even mainstream is, unfortunately, I think many scholars and many certainly regular folks do not really believe that we have expertise, that there's a such thing as Black studies expertise, that there are people who can actually diagnose racism clinically in the way a doctor can diagnose a disease. And so they just think we're just out here talking. and that they're talking and we're sharing our opinion and they're sharing their opinion, and my opinion is just as valuable as yours, even though your opinion is grounded in what you think is truth or what you think is evidence, but it's actually been consistently disproven. And so I think that's part of the larger sort of racist idea that devalues scholarship by Black people, or that refuses to recognize that there's a whole body of scholarship that has precisely studied and operationalized racism and what it is, right? And because there's, as Saida was talking, there's so much, she called it sort of white ignorance and even sort of denial about even that racism exists. So I think that also filters in here, in this conversation.
And much of what Black thought allows and explores is not just, I hate to say, not just racism and anti-racism.
Yeah.
I don't want to in any way suggest that those are secondary or tertiary things. I'm just saying that I want students to understand that there's also just a hunger for knowledge, right? And a hunger for just information and things that were hidden from us, hidden from you, hidden from all of us, that are interesting and that enrich our perspectives on life. And that's what motivates us all more than as much as anything else.
Seriously, and I want to, make clear to students that, we overrepresent the humanities and social sciences, but Black scholarship really runs the gamut of scholarship, right? So shout out to all my Black scientists, right? Shout out to all my folks in STEM, all my folks, doing big data, all my folks doing, genetics, like all of that stuff. You don't have to leave your Blackness at the door to do that either, right? Like I literally was on a podcast, thank you, Dr. Janina Jeff, who was just about race and genetics, right? And that was so valuable to me, and I got to teach that in my class because we start with the Human Genome Project, right? We start with the biological myths of race. All of us, as Louis was just saying, all of us are, we encounter, racism in the field, and all of us, I think, you can, some of our work engages that more some than others, but there is also that thirst for knowledge that says that your knowledge cannot be complete if you have left melanated peoples of the world out of it.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why I don't asterisk, my Black scholarship. That's not a categorization of ineptitude to me. To me, that's like, I'm the fullest scholar, I'm a Black scholar.
I said to myself that if I had to describe what I like to do about being a Black scholar or a scholar is, people ask me about methodology these days because of the work I've written. And I say, my methodology is this. There's some great books and great songs and great music out there that you people don't know about. Yeah, that's my methodology. There's a lot of cool stuff out there that we are digging for and exposing. And what it does to you culturally, intellectually, politically is slightly unpredictable. But I feel that part of my job is to go, you got to check this out. Yeah. Oh my God, how did people not know Frantz Fanon? When I was in grad school, no one read Frantz Fanon. Now everybody reads Frantz Fanon.
I read him in undergrad, not in grad school. See? Absolutely.
Things like that.
Yeah, I read him undergrad. We read him a lot at Spelman, actually.
Or like, now we talk about Afrofuturism and science fiction. I was back in college and high school saying, science fiction has a lot to say to us as Black people. Like, no, you know what you're talking about, right? Yeah. Now it's like Lovecraft country.
Or George Clinton.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
right.
Or even arguing that, hey, George Clinton should be studied.
Right, George C. Wolfe is an American treasure, absolutely.
We should study that,
yes,
and
absolutely.
take it seriously.
Absolutely.
Let's go over here with a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, a little bit.
All right, good evening. This is more of a tangential question, but to harken back, y'all expressed that there's pressure, a lot of pressure and responsibility as Black scholars in the United States in this current day and age. As individuals, how do you handle that pressure? How do you stay mentally healthy?
That's a great one.
Well,
Assuming we are.
Right.
Right.
It's a constant struggle, as Angela Y. Davis said.
Right.
Freedom. I'm going to do a little shout out to myself and my, my second book project is about a history of Black rest. Because I was interested in, you know, I feel I'm a little bit concerned about the self-care hashtag and the kind of performative self-care and the pressuring of people to do self-care in a particular way.
Consumer
So
self-care.
as a historian, I was like, well, what does history have to tell, right? I know where to go. Like, I just am going to go to the same place and look for the answers that's what I do. But so I was like, okay, I want to try to figure out what rest and what community care and an ethics of care has looked like historically and bring that forward, because I think we could really learn from it. And so, so when Angela Davis, you know, gave her papers to the Schlesinger, there was that two-day conference that was amazing. And at some point at the end of that, there was a space for high school students to ask questions of Angela. And one of the students stood up and said, you know, can you talk about self-care? Because, you know, I mean, because self-care, you know, it's trending and there's a hashtag. And, you know, Angela was like, well, we didn't do it very well. But she looked out to Erica Huggins, who was in the audience, and she was like, Erica, remember when we tried to get Huey to do yoga and he didn't want to do it, and who knows what it would have been like if he had done the yoga. You know, and they laughed. So yes, Huey P. Newton, right? One of the founders of the Black Panther Party. But Angela's sister was also in the audience, and Fania had talked like the first day about how when Angela got out of prison, she spent that whole year in the streets, right? Like partying. And I was like, you know what? I'm hearing things that are representative of care, right? Of self-care, of community care, of an ethics of care that is about sustainability, it's about preservation, but it's not individual, right? I mean, and you know, Foucault talked about that about kind of an individualist approach to care. But Audre Lorde talked about it differently. So I think what I'm trying to pay attention to is what I'm doing, even when that is the outcome of which is self-care, even if I'm not you know, it's not the hot bath or whatever. I don't know, what are we doing now? We're doing our nails? I don't know what we're doing. But, I mean, I'm also doing my nails. But the point is, I'm just trying to like I'm trying to pay attention to the kinds of things I'm ending up doing that feel like they are caring for myself, even if they have not been identified by the hashtag. Because I am still here, right? I show up to work. I get up in the morning, and you know, and I'm still engaged despite the conditions that we are living under right now and the kind of realities that we have to face every single day. So I'm trying to make the list is what I'm doing, and I don't know that I can give you the list, but obviously something, right? I mean, and I think I want to encourage people to pay attention and be cognizant of what they're doing that is helping to sustain themselves and the people that they love, and to identify those things, as opposed to like trying to do the hashtag.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm working with some students to look at particularly Black and brown mental health. And you know, one of the conversations we got into was precisely that. It may not always be an individual thing. It is a collective thing. And I think back to, you know, you called me country earlier. You know, us country folks, that's how we did it.
No,
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It was a walk with other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we did a little root medicine too.
Right.
But you know, that healing
Absolutely.
But root
was much
medicine
more of a
too
And that
is
your
also
community
collective.
heals you.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. I think more often than not, it's collective and community. And because we are, you know, sort of in bed with consumer capitalism in particular ways and racial capitalism.
Yeah, it's like go to the spa individually.
We
instead
actually,
of,
I feel like we can't see those things that are community and collective. We don't honor
like
them.
this.
Yeah, you know, I want to say this to that question because it's such a good question. You know, again, I came up in the 80s and apartheid was, you know, in our household, that was like all, you know, apartheid was what every day was what we were doing, right? You know, I remember my first march was like 4 years old. There's a photo of me, I think it's my BU profile, holding my, anti-apartheid sign, because that's what we were about. And we saw the fate of South Africa is completely tied to the fate of Black people in this country. And one of the keyest things I remember about apartheid, besides realizing like, oh my God, this is children leading this movement, that really resonated with me, But also, apartheid lasted an entire generation, entire lifespan. And people said, and we still fell in love, and we still made babies, and we still made wonderful music, and we still made poetry, right? And they still made art, and like that these things were not, for Black people, have never been paradoxical. That in the middle of the movement, we still do all the things that bring humanity to us because you can't suppress our humanity.
Well, and also because those things actually help to sustain
That
the
is
movement, right?
exactly that, right? Exactly that.
We can't be fully engaged without those things.
Exactly that. And so I have never seen a conflict. I think, first of all, number one thing is my idea of happiness and the worldview that I was brought up with was that happiness was never a hedonistic sense of like doing it for you. Like if I were to just say I was just happy, my family would be so disappointed in me. What have you done for your people? What have you done that makes any history? What have you done that does anything for someone else? The idea of sort of this self-serving happiness is not enough. I think that's a very consumerist Western idea of happiness, and it ain't working for them because they're all on Xanax. All right? My idea of happiness has always been the collective, and the collective sustains me. And so in what we do, this is exactly what keeps me going. Paula's my girl. It is no coincidence that our closest friends are probably, 99%, other women in academia, because that's what sustains us. Like, the same people I might co-author a paper with, I'm going out to dinner and we're gonna kiki about, Megan and Tory Lanez. It's like, this is what I do, right? And that's how it was always done. When you see James Baldwin doing this behind Maya Angelou, it's because they really partied together. That's how it's always been done. That does sustain the movement.
All right, so let me break in for a second. Everybody's got to divulge a little secret. Tell me what's bringing you joy right now.
What is bringing me joy right now?
I told you, Megan and Tory.
I may ask everybody that, so.
That is a wonderful question. What brings me joy right now?
Right now.
My nephews, my two Black nephews, they call me every day. I'm their only aunt. I love that, they know that, Auntie's gonna send us books, or, Auntie's gonna, books and shoes. I sustain joy really from knowing that I'm doing something that, I'll break it down like this. The people who really love what they do are the people for whom you can't put it down. You can't get a musician to retire.
Oh, yeah.
They can't put it down, right? I can't put this down. Every time I write something, I feel smarter about it. And I can't put that down. And then I get to call my father and we have this, a 2-hour-long conversation that gets me so pumped about what I'm about to write. And this is who I really am. That brings me tremendous joy, knowing that I will someday be earthworm food, and everything I wrote will be here in 100 years.
Ibram, what's bringing you joy right now?
I think probably right now in this moment that that the whole world realizes that our president's a con artist. That the dude paid $750.
Right, New York
already knew.
Right now, right.
Well, well, I guess when I say the whole world, I guess I'm hoping maybe even some of his supporters, which maybe that denial, but it just brings me joy that, we knew all along why he was hiding what he was hiding. And, a lot of people, they're trying to figure out ways to defend the indefensible. So watching that, and, is certainly bringing me joy. But I mean, just our conversation right now, I mean, this is what brings me joy, locking heads with other intellectuals.
Similarly, I think, I feel like the times that I'm sort of most happiest, because I also don't traffic in like happy and joy. Those are not really, that's just not who I am. I think that I'm probably most quote unquote happy when I'm like having a discussion, a kind of passionate discussion about things, and drawing. I mean, I'm thinking about a conversation I had yesterday that was like 2 hours long with a Black Googler who works at Google, right? So he's like a genius.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a whole debate about like population control and climate change. And
As you do.
as we do, it was like 2 hours long. It was exasperating.
Right.
But, I think in the end, I think those are the moments where we're like chopping it up about like real things that matter. That I find these kind of moments of respite.
Louis?
Joy. My particular struggle right now is I come from a very unusual background, and so it's an enormous privilege to have achieved what I've achieved professionally and artistically. And so were it not for the political crises and the pandemic and other things, I'd be just crazy happy right now because I'm doing everything I set out to do that no one thought I could do and that I barely thought I could do. So there's the joy of being constantly productive and being asked to contribute and to produce things, not just in terms of scholarship and literary work, but also in my work in sound design and other projects. It's really amazing, but I'm not happy because of what's going on. It's really, really very difficult for me. But the only thing that I would call joy now, and I'm going to call it joy even though it may not sound like joy, is that I realize that there are people who actually look to me for support. Not just family, but colleagues, students, readers, but particularly students and colleagues and being in positions of leadership. And I feel like I have to create joy in being there for other people. You have to be there for these folks and help them feel like they can get through this moment intellectually, politically, etc. And I feel like that's my only primary commitment. And it gives me joy because it takes me out of me. It takes me away from my own anxieties. The work is getting done because that's just who I am. I can't put it down. It's who I am. But emotionally, in terms of self-care, all I can do is focus on other care. And that's the only thing I'm able to do. It's not quite joy, but it's not misery.
I think that really resonates with me.
So let me get to a couple of questions here. This is from an alumna. How can a non-Black teacher in K through 12 teach anti-racism effectively without teaching the Black community as a monolith?
That's a wonderful question.
I mean,
and
also
thank
the
you.
Black.
We're all looking at you right away.
Right.
I mean, you've written the books and everything else. How can this? And I think this is probably from this alumna. How can this non-Black teacher in K through 12 education teach anti-racism effectively without treating the Black community as a monolith?
Well, Ibram, you have a YA version of your book, first off.
That's why we're looking at you.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think any teacher, but specifically a teacher that's trying to teach a community that they may not have sort of been born and raised into, and I think you can figure out ways to really respect the culture, even in the difference. But then, as you're respecting it, even seeking to really learn it more, while simultaneously constantly checking and reflecting on your relationship to those students, on your ideas about those students, even your policies and practices sort of towards those students, and be willing to even be freely honest and self-critical towards those students when you make mistakes. But I think fundamentally there's a huge learning curve, because I think one of the things I've found is the more I learn about my students, the more I know about my students, the more I can understand where they're coming from, the better that I could, for instance, use examples to sort of explain complicated matters. So I just would sort of urge you to really learn. I mean, really, like, you are literally the student, just as much as they are the students. And I think that could, but then you also, in order to learn and humble yourself in that way, you have to respect those students, in a tremendous way. And just too many people don't respect Black students, and also treat them as children, not as adults.
The only way to...
I was just going to add that I think it's I don't think they're the same thing. I think you can absolutely teach anti-racism and teach in an anti-racist way and not be teaching about Black history or Black
Yeah,
culture.
Oh yeah,
And what-
definitely.
Those two things are
Yeah.
not seen
Yeah.
as the same thing,
Yeah.
right? So that to teach in an anti-racist way with anti-racist
Right.
pedagogy and
Can
also
be in a
to
chemistry
be
class.
an
Right.
anti-racist
Right.
is not
Right.
Right.
necessarily a class about Black. So you
Yeah,
it doesn't-
exactly.
So yes, I would hope that you understand that Black history, that Black people, that Black
Mhm.
culture is not monolithic, but it's not necessarily related to teaching in an
Yeah.
anti-racist way or about anti-racism.
The only way to reduce the Black community to a monolith in teaching anti-racism is if you believe that there's only one form of anti-racism
Absolutely.
and only one set of responses to racism.
Absolutely.
One of the things I love teaching here, and which is kind of what my work is about, is, and I'll use a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He, probably the only quote I like from that book.
Different
He
conversation.
describes what he discovered when he went to Howard. He expected racism and anti-racism,
Yeah.
but what he discovered was a brawl of ancestors.
Right, that they had conflicts and they had
Right.
ideological differences.
And I remember
Yeah.
I taught this last week, and I'm like, that's yes,
Yeah,
a brawl
absolutely.
of ancestors.
Absolutely.
But that is also teaching anti-racism. We've had your Garveys and your Du Boises
Yes.
and your Booker T's and your Angela
Yes.
Davises and your Stokely. There's so many different types of discourses and arguments and perspectives that I find it hard for anyone to, by focusing on the diversity of Black political and cultural opinions, to reduce that community to a monolith. But it's still anti-racism.
Absolutely.
So we're gonna let one of our students in the audience get the last question.
Hello.
Hello.
So thank you so much for this amazing conversation. In this climate where all of this is, a lot of things are going on. There are the elections coming up, school, everything. What is the best piece of advice you could give to a college student? Even those who can't vote yet, because I'm only 17, so I won't be able to vote in the next election. But what is the best thing we could do to stay educated and to make a difference?
What was the last part? To stay educated
And to make a difference on top of voting.
I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways. One, what a wonderful generation to be a member of, right? My father, 74 years. You 72, Daddy? He's something like that. I think he just turned 73. And he says, this year reminds me so much of 1968, right? He says that over and over. And he was 17 and 65, right? So 68, he's still in college. He said, this reminds me so much of 68. And I think, wow, I'm so jealous, right? Like to be, a college student, to be, a teenager at this time. I'm going to say this in a couple of ways. To my, my white students in my class, I always kind of end class and I say, I'm so glad you took this. I'm so glad you came to this place to get this knowledge. This is only the tip of the iceberg. You officially have training wheels. Do not go thinking you can pop wheelies. You have training wheels. And here's the other thing I tell them. Do not congratulate yourself yet, because you ain't got no skin in the game. Wait until you have children and you are a homeowner and you are deciding to move off your block because Black people are moving in. Then you tell me about what this class meant to you, because you ain't got no skin in the game. For all that stuff you say about your parents were in college during apartheid. I'm sure they were at every protest too. And then when it came to get skin in the game, they switched it up, right? So every semester I tell my students that I would say to my students who feel like this moment is representing them finally, or at least for your lifetime, I love it, because I think of like so many people. I think every generation of Black students needs that moment, that moment of coalition, right? Like, Amadou Diallo did that, for a lot of the 90s generation. Apartheid did it for the 80s. In the 60s, you had a plethora. Black Power was doing in the 60s. You need that, right? And in fact, you become, from that, it's like the seeds then thrive and become this sort of diaspora of fruits to reap from that. So you go out into all of your various walks of life and you carry that with you. And that is how movements continue. That is how a race continues, right? That is the passing from one generation to another. And you should be able to challenge us, right? I'm 38 years old. You should be able to be like, I wonder why it's just now that it's the norm for Black women to call themselves feminists. What was it when you were in school? Because it wasn't when I was in school. When I was in school, calling yourself a Black feminist was like you're a lesbian or you were aligned with white women. Now, they all feminists, and I love it, right? Now it's the norm. Now, at Spelman College, they look at you crazy if you're not a feminist. That was not the norm in the year 2000 when I was coming through. Challenge us.
I would add that the thing to remember is that I know that in the US anyway, the voting age is like, you know, the age that you can become politically engaged. And what we know from history is that people at all ages were engaged. I mean, I'm thinking about, I mean, Washington, D.C., right? Folks didn't have nobody of any age could vote for anything, right? In D.C., which is the city that I study. So understanding that politicization, the understanding that you are invested in political change and that you are a political actor, right, is a process. And you can reach that, you know, you can come to that understanding about yourself as a political actor at any age.
Yes.
And you can be engaged in political change. I mean, what we know about political change is that it does not come exclusively through
the formal, absolutely,
franchise.
Yeah.
Right? Given that people have been fighting for the franchise for a long time and didn't have it, but all those people were political actors. And they made political and cultural change.
Founded that, right? Right. I mean, Black women were from 1800s through 1919 were doing politics without being able to vote.
I think that I'm envious of you young people in another way. Not because you dress better, because you don't.
You will when you
I'm envious of you because...
Why would you even say that? Go ahead, Louis.
I'm envious of you because you have something we didn't have, which is the arguments that we have made about politics and race and gender and sexuality. We had to make those arguments. You don't have to.
Y'all start.
One of the things that we're seeing in the world right now is a lot of what we've been trying to prove, you don't have to prove. It's like, look around you, right? So you're in a position to go, okay, issues of institutional racism, we couldn't say that in college.
The first time I ever heard anyone say white supremacy and not literally mean a white supremacist group in the mainstream was in like the last DNC, when I was literally watching TV and I was like, it took that long for the connect from what we had been saying for 30 plus years in academia. It took that long to enter the public lexicon. And I was like, oh my God, that's now fit for print, white supremacy.
So you folks have some stuff on your side, right? You have material, arguments that have been made. You got new ones to make. Right? You got new ones to make, but consciously build on what has been done before. I'm not saying agree with what's been done before. I'm saying build on what's been done before.
Ibram?
I mean, I would just echo everything that's been said, and I would just add, you can also join organizations. You can join organizations at BU. You can join organizations in this community. And that's one of the, so for me, I remember being in college, you know, joining and being a part of an organized body of people who are struggling for some sort of common good. I mean, there's just nothing, that to me is part of your education too.
Absolutely.
And at any level, local, right, university, local, hyper-local, national, I don't think, it doesn't matter, because what we know is that we need all of it.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be the president of it. You know, if you know, you go to college campuses, and if there are 50 students at a lecture, there are 50 different organizations. And I'm like, what if somebody needs to be the president of them? Really, like it can be, you know, and talking about that, you know, giving yourself purpose and, you know, and the collective, absolutely. When I was 18 years old, I literally was just hanging out, and I felt like the feminist, you know, majority alliance absorbed me. And all of a sudden I was at Take Back the Night protest, and that was my community. I was like, oh, and here's who I am now. I'm a Black feminist. And then my father became a Black feminist, and my mother were working.
And I would say, so one of my earliest organizations that I joined was on my college campus, and I would just be like the person who got the food.
Yeah, right.
Like that's who I was.
Right. I think I made time.
That's important.
I wasn't saying a bunch of
Yeah.
meetings. I wasn't like making any, I wasn't like
Yeah.
bringing folks together. But I laid out the food. I made sure that people ate, right?
Yeah.
I had the food set up when people came back from the march.
Yeah.
And I was doing documentation. So I was always taking pictures. I
Yeah,
was always
yeah.
taking notes. That's who I was. That was my contribution.
Yeah.
I want to, it's, what we're also, I think, ultimately saying, though, is that this is a time when you young people, all of us really, but you young people, we got to reinvent our notions of community.
Absolutely.
I don't think we have to reinvent them.
We just have to engage them.
We have to just remember what they are. We
Yeah.
have them. We don't need to reinvent anything, is where I am.
But I remember very clearly going to college, and in my experience, so I came out of predominantly white high school where you all are too young to remember that cartoon Daria, and there was Jody, Queen of the Negroes, and that's sort of my high school experience. Like I felt like I had to do everything because I was black. Well, if I'm not SGA president, we'll never have a black SGA president. And if I'm not in this club, we'll never have a black person's club. And then when I got to a black college, and there were a whole bunch of Saidas, I didn't know who I was anymore. And it was the most wonderful, darkest, richest experience of my life because I was just lost in the dark of like, who are you if you are not all these expectations of the obligations of what you did? Like, who are you for real? Not just the black girl who had to do everything. And I remember that time of feeling like, I don't know what I do. And then my sophomore year, it was like, oh, this is what I do. I write. I write and I go at toxic masculinity, which wasn't even a word then. And that gave me so much joy in terms of like, this community of women finally let me know who I was because I didn't have to do it all. They can be SGA president. She's far more organized than I am, right? She's way tougher than me. And I was like, I don't have to do all that stuff I hated doing. And I could find out who I was. And that was my contribution to it. It's like, you can just be the person who brings the food sometimes. You can just be the person who writes the column about it. You can just be the person who's at the bullhorn. Like, you really have to sit with the like, who am I in this tapestry? And that became the most seminal experience of my college career, of literally being lost and not knowing what I was going to contribute. And then I had the strongest identity you could have. No one could take that away from me after it.
And the groups and the communities don't have to be overtly political.
Yeah.
They're just different forms of interaction. And I think that really
Yeah.
matters. I think that matters a great deal.
All right, we could go on all night, but we're not allowed to do that. Right? Hey, thank you, folks. So good to have you here. Let's give them a round of applause. Well, we appreciate you being a part of this series, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. This has been recorded, and we will make it available through the Howard Thurman Center's website. And it is one of these things, you got a lot dropped on you, a lot of incredible stuff dropped on you. So I hope that folks will look at this over and over again. What a great experience. Good night, and all the best to you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you, Catherine.
Absolutely.
Good night, y'all.